Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone participating from all over the world. Thank you all for joining us today for the Goi Peace Youth event, How Can We Create Peace Through Nonviolence? My name is Tatsuru Nakayama. I'm Program Director for Youth Education at the Goi Peace Foundation based in Tokyo, Japan. I hope you will stay with us till the end. Okay, now we are so happy to welcome Mr. Kazu Haga, our special guest today, joining us from California, USA. Welcome to our program, Kazu. Give him big applause.
So much, thank you. Good evening, where I am. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be dialing from. Konnichiwa, hola,
Okay. Yeah. Can I introduce briefly to the participants?
Oh, of course, sorry.
Yeah, before you can start. Yeah, just a few minutes. Yeah. So let me briefly introduce Kazu to you. He's a trainer and practitioner of nonviolence and restorative justice, and a core member of the Ahimsa Collective and the Fierce Vulnerability Network, and author of Healing Resistance, a radically different response to harm. Kazu works with incarcerated people, youth, and activists from around the country of the United States. He has over 20 years of experience in nonviolence and social change work, and has been an active trainer since year 2000. We will first listen to his story and practices, and then learn what nonviolence is. So Kazu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's so beautiful to see so many countries represented. I wish I could speak to you all in all of your native tongues. I wish I could hear you all share your stories as well. But really honored to be here. I really want to thank everyone from the Goi Peace Foundation and for particularly all the young people who showed up. It's amazing to see young people from so many different countries want to talk about peace. Now, peace isn't always like the cool thing. And so to see young people who are dedicated to that work is really inspiring. So I want to thank all of you for participating in the programs of the Goi Peace Foundation, for showing up on this call. I want to start by sharing a little piece of my own story. And so I'm going to share my screen a little bit here. Let me see. Like anybody, I have a very long, complicated, windy story, but I want to start with something that happened to me when I was 17 years old. I think my introduction to peace work and to nonviolence work in a lot of ways changed when I was 17. This was back in 1998. At that time in my life, I was in a really broken place. I was living in a really conflicted household with a lot of harm and a lot of violence happening. I was really lost. I had dropped out of high school when I was 15, and I was doing nothing productive with my life, just looking for some sense of purpose. And I heard about this project called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. This was a project that was started by a Japanese Buddhist order called Nipponzan Myohoji. And this order, Nipponzan Myohoji, they had a temple near the town that I used to live in Massachusetts on the East Coast. And they worked with a group of interfaith people to start this project called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. And what they were going to do was walk from Massachusetts, which is on the northeastern part of the United States, all the way down to New Orleans, which is in the southernmost part of the United States. So probably about 2,500 miles or well over 3,000 kilometers. And the reason why they wanted to do that was they wanted to retrace the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the name that was kind of given to the slave trade in the United States when people were stolen from the continent of Africa and brought to the United States to be slaves. And they wanted to walk this journey in reverse and visit sites where there were slave rebellions or auction sites where slaves were sold, plantations where they had to work, and to really understand the history of enslavement and understand how to heal from it. Because on this pilgrimage, we learned that sometimes people can live through so much violence that that violence is not possible to heal in one lifetime. And so the violence that people are not able to heal, it lives in our bodies as trauma, and that trauma can be passed down for generations and generations. And so I learned on that walk that if I wanted to heal racism today in 2024, I have to understand and heal all the way back to its roots when it first started. And so I spent 6 months with this group of interfaith people studying and understanding the history of racism in the United States and trying to figure out how we can heal from it. And after that 6 months, I spent a year overseas living in Buddhist temples in India, Nepal, a little bit in Sri Lanka, and learned more about Buddhism and learned more about nonviolence. And when I came home to the United States, I became a nonviolence trainer in the late 1990s. And what that meant was I was facilitating nonviolence training for large groups of people, preparing them to go to large protests and demonstrations so that they can fight injustice. Some of these pictures that you see at the top is I was part of a campaign to close the School of Americas, which was a military camp, a School of Americas in Georgia, in the southern part of the United States, where the US military would invite militaries from mostly Central and Latin America and train those soldiers in warfare and how to be better at killing people, essentially. And a lot of these soldiers would come to the School of Americas and then go back to Colombia, El Salvador, all these other places, and oftentimes be responsible for human rights violations and atrocities. So there were a lot of activists who were trying to close this school. I was also part of the movement against the World Trade Organization. You see in the middle picture, the anti-globalization movement, where we were fighting for better policies that and that fought against organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, that created trade agreements that helped rich countries and hurt a lot of poor countries. You also see a picture of a man named Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is a political prisoner in the United States. That was part of campaigns to free political prisoners, people who were sent to prison because of their political beliefs. And all of these things, being part of so many protests and demonstrations and campaigns, taught me that nonviolence is not about what not to do, right? A lot of times people think nonviolence is about, well, I'm a nonviolent person, so I'm not going to be violent. But I learned that nonviolence is actually about action and it's about doing something, right? And I'll share a little bit more about that later. But even with all of this work as a nonviolence trainer, I didn't really understand what the word nonviolence meant until 2008. And in 2008, I took a 2-day workshop on a philosophy called Kingian nonviolence conflict reconciliation. And Kingian nonviolence is a philosophy that grew out of the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, of course, was the leader of the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And this 2-day work, by the time I took this workshop, I had been doing nothing but activist work for the last 10 years of my life. A lot of that time I was a nonviolence trainer. But this 2-day workshop showed me that I actually knew nothing about what the word nonviolence meant. And this 2-day workshop completely changed my life. And since then, understanding better what nonviolence means and what it means to practice nonviolence has been the central focus of my life. And one of the biggest things that this philosophy of Kingian nonviolence taught me, that at the core of the teachings of nonviolence is about a belief in interdependence, that I am that I am deeply interdependent with every single other human being and all other forms of life on Earth. And that if I want to be free, I have to help all people be free. And I learned through this that in nonviolence, people are never the enemy, that systems are the enemy, that there are no such thing as bad people. There are people who do bad things, but people are never the enemy. And that in nonviolence, we are working to free and liberate all people, right? And so creating peace work isn't just about changing laws and changing policies, but it's also about healing relationships and the work of reconciliation, right? And all of this work in understanding what nonviolence really meant led me to doing a lot of work in my own trauma healing, starting in about 2012. And I really began to understand that violence isn't just a thing that happens out there, that it's also a thing that lives in my own heart. And largely because I had been through so many traumatic events in my early childhood, and that I had been so hurt by that, and I hadn't gone through a process of being able to heal from that hurt. And so I was carrying all of this hurt, all of this violence in my own heart. And so I'm understanding more and more these days that if I'm not able to heal my own traumas, then I can't be peaceful in my own heart. And if I can't be peaceful in my own heart, then I can't support creating peace in the world out there. And so I realized that nonviolence is just about doing the work inside of my own heart as it is about doing work out there in the world. And I want to share perhaps one of the most important things that I learned in my journey in nonviolence, specifically in Kingian nonviolence. And I want to start here. I'm going to give you a few seconds to see if you can identify the difference between the picture on the right and the picture on the left. So about 4 things that are different. And I'm not sure if you were able to catch all of them, but there's the butterfly, one of the flowers is missing, there's an extra bird in the sky. And I want to move on to one more. This one's a little bit more difficult. Try to find the difference between these 2 images. There's a few more. So I'll give you a few more seconds here while I take a sip of water. And so there are all of these differences. A couple extra apples, the tail on the pig is missing, their mouth is open. I'm not sure if you can see, but the color of their suspenders is a little bit different. So one more, I'm going to do one more. What is the difference between the word on the left and the word on the right? And it should be pretty simple. It's the hyphen, right? Non-violence and non-hyphen violence. Some people write nonviolence without the hyphen, without the dash, and some people write nonviolence with the hyphen, with the dash. And most times we think it doesn't make a big difference, right? But I learned in Kingian nonviolence that the hyphen changes everything. When we put the hyphen in the word and we write nonviolence as non-hyphen violence, what it does is it separates the word, right? It makes it almost into 2 words, non-hyphen violence. And what non-hyphen violence is saying is that something is not violent, right? Something is the absence of violence. And I learned that understanding nonviolence as just the absence of violence, that I'm being nonviolent because I'm not practicing violence in this moment, is the biggest and most dangerous misunderstanding of the idea of nonviolence. When people think, oh, I'm a nonviolent person because I don't hit people, that is the most dangerous misunderstanding of the word. And I'll share why. This is an image of the view that used to be outside of my window. I recently moved about 2 years ago, but I lived in this apartment for about 12 years in Oakland, California. And it was a neighborhood that was a beautiful neighborhood in some ways. There were about 6 or 7 languages that were being spoken just in this one corner alone. But it was also a neighborhood that had a lot of challenges and a lot of violence, a lot of conflict, a lot of tension. People were yelling and screaming all day and all night. There was a lot of crime, a lot of violence. And one morning, this was about 10 years ago, maybe, I was taking a nap and I woke up because there was an argument that was happening outside. And just two people were arguing. And this is such a common thing in that neighborhood that I was actually just trying to ignore it and go back to sleep. But this argument kept getting louder and louder, and it kept getting worse and worse. And so finally, I decided to get out of my bed and look down the window. And right below my window, there was a woman on the ground who was getting beaten. And she was screaming for help. And so I jumped up out of my bed and I put on my clothes because I was taking a nap. I ran downstairs, I opened up the gate. And by this point, they had gone across the street to the other corner that you see in this picture. And the fight was still going on. And so I ran across the street and I broke up this fight. It took me a little bit to get down there, right? It took me a few minutes because I was asleep. And so by the time I got down there, about 15 of my neighbors had heard the noise and they had all come outside and they were just standing around watching there, watching this woman get beaten, not doing anything to help. And I oftentimes tell people that all of my neighbors who were just watching this woman get beat, not doing anything to help, were practicing non-hyphen violence, right? Because they were explicitly not being violent in that moment. They weren't throwing the punches, they weren't throwing the kicks, they were just standing there. And in fact, you could even argue that I was being more violent than my neighbors were, because when I broke up the fight, I did use a little bit of physical force to separate the two people who were fighting, and I might have hurt one of them in the process, right? So you can see how big of a misunderstanding we can have when we think that nonviolence is about what not to do, right? Nonviolence is not about not being violent. Of course, that's part of it, right? Part of the commitment to nonviolence is about living a life that causes less and less harm. But nonviolence is so much more about what you're going to do. When you see violence, when you see injustice in your community, in your family, in your world, in your heart, what are you going to do about that violence? Right? So it's much more about what you're going to do than it is about what not to do. And because nonviolence, we think, is non-hyphen violence, it's about not being violent, we think it's about what not to do. As long as I'm not being violent, as long as I'm not the person throwing the punch, then I'm being a nonviolent person. But that's very dangerous because we can see wars happening all over the world and say, you know what, I'm not going to do anything about that. We can see poverty, homelessness, violence, all of these things happening and say, you know what, that's none of my business. I'm just going to stand here and watch and look and not participate in the violence. But that's not what it means to be nonviolent. Dr. Martin Luther King was very clear that being nonviolent was about having the courage to step into situations of violence and go into escalated moments of conflict and trying to be an agent of change. This misunderstanding of nonviolence also leads to a very dangerous misunderstanding of the idea of peace. So I want to share a few slides about that. This woman, her name is Autherine Lucy. She just recently passed away. Autherine Lucy was the first Black student to go to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa in the southern United States at a time when segregation was still alive, when racism was still very, very much alive and written into the laws. And so you can imagine what the environment of that college campus was like the first day she was there. These are some of the images of what happened. A lot of racist white people were really upset that a Black person was on campus. And so they rioted. They broke windows, they burnt crosses. You can see in the picture on the left, at one point, a mob surrounded the car that Autherine Lucy was traveling in and climbed up on top of it, started jumping up and down. And so I wonder if you can imagine what the school did to respond to this violence. They expelled Autherine Lucy. They kicked her out of the school. They said that the reason why all of this violence is happening is because you are here. So in order for us to protect our school, you need to leave. So they kicked her out of the school, even though she did nothing wrong. The next day, because she wasn't there anymore, the people stopped rioting. And the local newspaper ran this headline that said, "Things are quiet in Tuscaloosa today. There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama." And I wonder if you all agree with that statement, that there is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama, right? The riots had stopped. No one was breaking windows. No one was screaming anymore. So there was peace, right? Dr. Martin Luther King gave a sermon in response to what happened that day. The sermon is called "When Peace Becomes Obnoxious." And in that sermon, he said, what happened on the campus the next day wasn't a real peace. He called that a negative peace. He said negative peace is the absence of tension that comes at the cost of justice. Negative peace is quiet and it's calm, but it comes at the expense of justice by sweeping issues under the rug and not actually dealing with the real problems, right? If someone is screaming in my face, that's not a peaceful situation. So if I punch them in the face and they get knocked out on, did I just create peace because that person isn't screaming at me anymore? It's quiet. So did I just create peace by punching this person? That sounds crazy to say, right? But that's actually how a lot of our society understands peace, right? A lot of people think that as long as things are quiet and calm, then things are peaceful. And you were just saying how last session you talked about the bombing in Hiroshima. I guarantee you that the moment after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, that things were really quiet. But is that peaceful? Right? Did we create peace by launching a nuclear weapon? And again, it sounds crazy to say it this way, but this is how the world tries to create peace. This is why so many people advocate for war, right? We say, oh, if we just kill all the terrorists, then we can have peace. Same thing with mass incarceration. I do a lot of work in the prison system because I think prisons are more violent than they are peaceful. They create more violence in the world. And we just say, oh, if we just lock up all the bad people, then we will have peace. In the United States, oftentimes when peace activists and nonviolence activists gather to fight for justice, the police shoot us with pepper spray and lock us up because they say, oh, well, if all the protesters would just go to jail, then we would have peace. Things would be more quiet, right? And another form of negative peace that is very common, it happens in a lot of like colleges and universities, in non-governmental organizations and professional workplaces and corporations, in a lot of faith communities, where people think that talking about racism or sexism or power dynamics or injustice is uncomfortable and it's rude. So let's just pretend that everything is okay and just keep going on about our day, right? My family has been through a lot of harm and violence early in our childhood. We went through a lot of stuff that did not create peace, right? There was a lot of violence in our home. But because I'm Japanese. I grew up in Japan. And a lot of Japanese people, we love negative peace. We're actually conflict averse people. When there's really difficult things that are bothering us, it's hard for us to talk about it. So if you have dinner with our family, you might think we have a very peaceful family because we don't argue with each other. But just beneath the surface, there's so much harm and pain and tension that we need to learn to talk about. And so if these things are forms of negative peace, then we have to realize that positive peace, which is real peace, can be really loud and messy. Like my family has started to have really difficult conversations about what it takes to heal all of our relationships. And those conversations can be messy, it can be loud, people can be crying, because healing from harm, healing from violence can be a very messy experience, right? When we are out there protesting for Black Lives Matter or protesting for environmental protection, it can be loud and it can be messy, but that's sometimes what is necessary to create positive peace, right? One of the things that nonviolence taught me is that creating peace in a violent world can be it's a loud and messy process, and it's uncomfortable. And nonviolence is about learning to be okay with discomfort. Positive peace works for justice for all people, because negative peace is oftentimes quiet and calm, and it gives some people peace, but at the expense of peace and justice for other people. It builds towards what Dr. Martin Luther King called beloved community by addressing the root causes of violence. And it creates a world where healing is possible for all people. And so for the last 25 years almost now, that's been my journey, is to try to understand how to move closer to positive peace by advocating for justice, by healing my own wounding, and by creating space for other people to heal theirs. And so I want to pause there and invite the Goy Peace Foundation's executive director onto the screen. And I know we're going to have some discussion, and then we'll pause after a little while and invite discussion from the rest of the participants as well. But we'll invite Maki-san onto the screen now.
Okay, thank you, Kazu, to start up your conversation. To start up our thoughts, provoking presentation. Thank you so much. And now let me introduce, as Kazu mentioned, that Ms. Maki Kawamura, our executive director, as an interviewer of the next part of this conversation. Kazu and Maki, the floor is yours.
Kazu-san, thank you so much for your inspiring presentation about violence and nonviolence and negative peace. I was so inspired by your story. So I like to take some moments to ask more questions to hopefully expand and deepen the conversation about your work. So I learned from you that nonviolence is creating positive peace in the world. So how do you and then you talked about trauma and violence in your conversation. So first, I want to ask you, what is trauma? I mean, what is trauma to you? How do you view trauma? Is that a big question?
It's a big question,
Yeah.
but it's a really important question. First of all, I think it's important for all of us to realize that trauma is natural. Trauma is a natural response that our bodies have when we experience things that feel so dangerous or are so frightening that it overwhelms our body's capacity to cope with it. I can experience something so sad or so scary that to really process what just happened to me feels so scary. So I'm just going to bury all of the feelings deep inside my body. And that's what trauma is.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, when trauma lives inside of our body, it can be from something that happened 25, 30 years ago. But when something happens and it triggers that trauma, it brings up all of those feelings again because we never processed it. And all of that fear, all of the anxiety that we experienced 25, 30 years ago gets triggered in our bodies, and our bodies can't tell if it's something that is happening now or if it's something that happened 25 years ago. And so that's the kind of like simple definition of what trauma is. It's a lot more layers to that, but
so it comes from the hurt and anger, and it's like protecting you. This trauma is protecting you to go on your life, even though there's anger and hurt. But how do you work? Because you have studied nonviolence for a long time, how do you work with these anger or despair or pain?
yeah, there's not one way. I think there's some things that work for some people and some things that don't work for other people. I know that for myself, years ago, I was in a retreat called a jam, and it's one of the most healing spaces that I've ever been to. They happen all over the world, and I shared a story of something that I experienced in my childhood, like my childhood trauma experiences. It was the first time I ever spoke about it out loud. And at that point in my life, the story that I had told myself is these childhood experiences that I went through, it was really hard at the time, but it happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I'm over it. I've moved on with my life. It's not that big of a deal. But the first time I talked about it out loud at that jam, the moment the words started to come out of my mouth, I completely broke down and I could barely breathe. And in that moment, I realized how traumatic those childhood experiences were and how that trauma was still alive in my body. And for 15, 20 years, I had told myself, oh, this happened so long ago that I've healed from it. I'm over it. I'm moved on. And from that moment on, I've been trying to heal those traumas. And a lot of that has been developing the courage to just talk about it with people that I trust and talk about it in safe containers with people who are skilled enough to help me heal, right? Like healing from trauma is not that much different than healing from a physical wound and going to the doctor's office and getting an operation. Like getting an operation requires a really skilled doctor to cut open your wounds and clear the infections and sew you back up. And trauma healing is the same way. So talking about it with people that are skilled and trusted, but also being in nature, writing about it, art. There's so many different ways that we can heal. We just have to find what works for us.
So you think about you're telling us that talking about your past trauma in the safe place is one step forward to healing that trauma, right? But how does the healing process move on after talking about your trauma?
So I'll just share in my own example. When I was a child and I was living through all these traumatic experiences, they were so scary for me that even though I was going through them, I almost never cried because I think my young body knew that if I allowed myself to be as scared as I should have been, like I probably would have been overwhelmed. And so I just like all of the feelings of sadness and loneliness, I suppressed into my body. And so a lot of the healing that I have to do now is to remember and to tell the stories of what I went through and to try to feel the feelings that I couldn't feel then that are like frozen in my body. So all of the fear that I couldn't allow myself to fully feel then, I have to allow myself to feel now. I know that the experiences that I went through were so scary, but I made it. I'm okay, right? So I have a little bit more capacity to allow the young 6-year-old boy that's still alive inside of my body to actually cry and to like retroactively feel the emotions that I wasn't able to feel back then. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, but you talked about in your presentation that personal trauma affects this holistic trauma that's happening in the world, and that is why you took your this path of 3,000 kilometers of this what do you say, mid
The middle passage.
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So how do you see this personal trauma and the systemic trauma that's happening in the world?
Yeah, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the concept of fractals.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say this in Japanese, but fractals are a geometric pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again. So, like, you see a lot of fractals in nature, like the nautilus seashell, or a lot of like succulent plants and Romanesco broccoli. So a fractal is like no matter how small of something you zoom into or how large you zoom out, because the pattern repeats itself, it looks the same, right? And I think the universe is built on fractals. It's a universal truth. And so trauma and healing from trauma, I think also works in fractals. And so in the same way that I experienced childhood trauma, and because I never talked about it, because I never healed from it, that trauma impacted all of my relationships and my ability to be peaceful in my own heart. In the same way, I think that United States of America as a country has a collective childhood trauma, right? Like the United States in its like in the childhood of its country experienced slavery of African people, genocide of indigenous people, indentured servitude of Irish people, and all these people. And that kind of violence, I think, created a collective trauma in the United States as a collective being. And so I think for the United States to heal and to become more peaceful, we need to go through the same process that I did of remembering our childhood traumas, talking about the stories, talking about how scary it was so that I can heal from it. And I think, nations and communities, organizations all have similar things where we experience something together collectively that were so scary and that we've never really processed. And if we don't process that brokenness and the fractures of the trauma will continue to impact us and prevent us from living truly peaceful lives.
So with your work as this nonviolent trainer, you are trying to create this safe place for people to talk about their trauma so that it will heal that individual as well as this collective world that we're in. I understand that way. So as I would like to know like how this healing process actually occur and how you can you share us some of the example that you've witnessed
Sure.
that happened throughout your work that stays in your heart for a long time?
Yeah, I want to share one story, but before I do that, I also just want to share that, there's been a lot of science around trauma and how trauma affects our bodies these days. And so we know through science that when someone experiences trauma and has a lot of trauma that they haven't been able to heal, it has a physiological impact on the brain. Like when people have trauma, we are only able to see things in black and white and right and wrong. And so we see in the world today, like the world is so polarized where you're either on this team or that team. And then if you're on this team, you have to hate the other team. And we get into all these conflicts. And that's actually a sign of trauma, right? Our ability to, when we are traumatized, we're not able to empathize. The part of our brain that is responsible for empathy literally gets shut down when we are having a trauma response. And so not understanding how much trauma impacts us as individuals and as communities is really dangerous.
Mm.
And, in response to your question, one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed is, I do a lot of work in the prison system in California. And several years ago, I was able to facilitate a dialogue between a man in prison and the mother of the person who this man in prison murdered 20 years earlier, Richard and Cynthia. So Richard murdered Cynthia's son, and 20 years later, they wanted to have a conversation with each other. And even though they came together through like the worst form of violence you can imagine, somebody taking the life of another person's child, through these conversations, there was a moment when Richard and Cynthia was holding Richard's hand, and she was saying, I had a dream that I needed to hold your hands because these are the hands that took my son's life away, and I needed to have a different relationship with these hands. And so they told me that through prayer, through decades of prayer, through cultural practices, they were able to heal their traumas enough that they actually wanted to come face to face, and for Cynthia to forgive Richard and Richard to apologize to Cynthia in a deep, meaningful way. And so, again, there's no one way to heal trauma, but having the courage to say, I'm sorry, having the courage to forgive somebody that hurt you can be really, really powerful ways that we're able to heal through some of the most traumatic moments of our lives.
Wow. So you've been working with Richard and Cynthia separately before they meet with each other?
Yeah, we worked with each side for about 6 months before we brought them together to really make sure they were ready, because it's probably the most difficult conversation either of them had ever had.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a lot of work supporting them both to heal. And they had been doing their own work for years and years before I met them as well.
So Cynthia, I think Cynthia at first like asked you to work on this trauma healing. Is it? I don't know how the process went. I don't know the detail of the stories, but I just
Yeah.
wonder, like, I can't believe this. Like, I have 3 daughters, but I can't believe to reconcile or have this forgive the murderer who murdered my daughter, and hold hands with that person who murdered. And it's just like beyond my imagination how to do that. But because you're working in these situations, you can see that all the people have this seed of healing and power of forgiveness in any of the people that in the world.
Yeah. I mean, one of my friends, Sujatha, also came from a very violent household, and her father was very abusive. And years ago, she was filled with rage and anger. And years ago, she actually got to meet privately with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And there's a crazy story about how that happened, but she was with the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, and said, what do? I cannot forgive my father. I can't let it go. And His Holiness just looked at her and said, my dear, have you been angry long enough? And there's an old Buddhist saying that says, hating somebody is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Mm.
When you hate someone and when you're holding on to resentment, that other person's not even thinking about you, but that hatred is destroying you. It hurts you more than it hurts them. And I think in that moment, Sujatha realized that, yeah, like having this resentment towards her father was doing nothing to her father, but it was destroying her inside out. And that in Kingyan nonviolence, we say it's an internal violence of the spirit, that it's actually an act of violence that we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah.
So
Wow. So realizing that and then bringing that into healing is so. Cynthia has changed after he forgiving Richard. Her daily life has changed probably because she was able to forgive Richard the way
Yeah.
she did.
And I think because of that, she's able to talk about what happened a lot more. And in fact, these days she works with other incarcerated people or young people who have been through violence and other people who have lost people that they love to homicide and counsels them and shares her story. And yeah, I think it's become something that's actually healing for her to talk about more and more. Whereas before, it was really hard for her to talk about the fact that she lost her son to murder.
And you told us about this healing process that happened, and it starts with talking about this trauma. And then I think people needs to have big courage to talk about their trauma. Do you think talking for the very little first step, do you think talking about trauma by yourself is would help as well before talking with others?
Yeah, again, trauma is a funny thing where one thing that can work for one person might actually have a bad impact for another person. So it's always important to trust yourself and to that you will know when you're ready to take the next step. But sometimes journaling about it can be helpful. Sometimes reading somebody else's story, if they went through a similar experience, can be helpful. Sometimes talking out loud to somebody can be helpful. Sometimes writing a poem about it or making a painting can be helpful. But it's also important to know that when you open up about your pain, it's a little risky, right? Like when you go into surgery, it's risky because they're cutting you open. And I've had experiences in my life where I've talked about my trauma with somebody who didn't have the skills to support me. And the responses to some of what I was sharing actually hurt me even more. So it's really important to go slowly, to move with people that you can trust, to know that like it's actually not helpful to talk about your traumatic experiences with anybody you want whenever you want, to really create ritual around it and to move in a way that gives honor to the depth and the importance of this work.
You are telling us that there's no one way to work with the trauma, but there are young participants from the world where this big violence is happening, or there are participants whose family have maybe the violence. Can you give us like practices that you can share with us more, like journaling or talking with professionals, but from the perspective of nonviolence that can be applied to some of our like daily life?
Mm-hmm. Sure. The the first thing is like your safety matters first. Like that has to, like you can't heal if you're constantly surrounded by violence. That's not how healing works. And so if there's anything you can do, even just for brief moments, to create a container of safety where you can take a deep breath. And that might mean if you have access to nature, nature can be incredibly healing. If you don't have access to nature, maybe going around for a 10-minute walk in your neighborhood. And maybe even for some people, that is dangerous. And I think someone in the chat earlier mentioned like mindfulness and meditation. Like there are spiritual practices that can give you a sense of safety, even if it's just for 10 seconds, just in your own body. I remember one day I was in a prison in California and we were doing our morning check-in with the group that I was meeting with. And one man said, I woke up this morning and I found myself in prison, but I chose to be happy because that is the choice that I have. And so even in a violent place like a prison, he realized that at least in these small moments, he can take a deep breath and know that in just this moment, I'm safe.
Mm.
And so, whether it's an entire weekend in the forest or one deep breath, to find those moments of safety where you can take a deep breath and settle, I think is a really great place to start. And then your body will tell you what it needs to do from there.
Thank you very much. And also you're trying to, there are some question about healing. How can they help people heal? I know it's not easy to share tips, but when you are trying to create the safe place for people to talk about their trauma, what do you think about? What do you be
Yeah.
how are you be conscious about? What
Well, I think there's a way in which I actually want to scale this back. Like trauma healing is a really, really big thing. Like me healing from my trauma is the biggest thing I've ever done in my life, and it's something that I will continue to do for the rest of my life. There's smaller things that we can do that still contribute to healing. And one thing that I think about all the time, I don't know how it is elsewhere in the world, maybe this is just a US thing, but when I see a friend or a neighbor or whatever, I ask them, hey, how are you doing? But when I ask that, usually I don't actually mean it. What I expect is for me to say, hey, how are you doing? And for that person to say, oh, I'm doing good. How are you? And then we go about our day. Or sometimes when people ask me, hey, how have you been? I just say, oh, I've been good. How are you? Right? And we don't actually slow down to give each other space to say, wait a
mm,
second, how am I doing? Like we are witnessing climate crisis, war, pandemics. Like, how are we really doing? And how often do we give each other time and space to look someone in the eye and say, how
mm,
are you really doing? And sometimes it's helpful just to get together with a friend and put a timer on your phone and say, I want to know how you're doing. I'm going to give you these next 10 minutes and I'm just going to sit here and listen to you.
mm,
All you have to do is tell me how you're doing.
mm,
And then when the timer goes off, we'll change places and I'll tell you how I'm doing. Like even something as simple as that can actually go a long ways into helping us slow down and relax and just say, you know what? I'm actually feeling sad today. And just being able to name and notice, oh, I'm actually feeling sad can actually make things easier for you, you
mm.
know? Oftentimes we ignore the fact that we're not okay.
So true. So true. Even though people ask me how am I doing and I'm not feeling happy, I would say fine. Just as
Or
patterns. But that's so true. Just ask yourself, how am I doing? And at the same level, ask your families or friends, how are they feeling? And then sit down and talk about it. That is a beautiful way to really create,
uh,
yeah, everyday
some-
healing.
sometimes in workshops, we'll put people into pairs and have them ask each other, how are you doing? And then a timer will go off, and then we'll have them ask each other again, how are you really doing? And then they'll talk for a little while, and then a timer will go off, and then we'll have them ask each other, how are you really, really doing? And just deepening more and more. And I think like, sometimes I think in like Japanese culture, I don't want to say, oh, I'm really sad about this thing or I'm really struggling with this thing because I feel like I'm being a burden on somebody else. And
Mm,
I don't want to burden them with my problems. But the reality is that we are interdependent. And if you are not well, then I am not well. So if you're not well, I need to know that so I can figure out how to support you,
yeah.
right? And it's not just to make you feel better, it's also to help me.
That's true. That is the meaning that you talked about at the beginning of this interdependent, that we're not dependent from each other, but we're really giving so much influence on each other. So that's so true, I thought.
Yeah.
Also, like you shared at the very beginning that because you were like you had no life mission and then you dropped out of high school and you were bored, that you were able to go to this pilgrimage, right? And I love that story because you were able to discover your life's purpose because of nonviolence, because of that in that situation, right? And I like, including my daughter, there are young people who are seeking their own passion and they're like a kind of rushing to find their life purpose and trying to do so much to find life purpose. So if there is like advice that you can give to these people who are searching for their life purpose, how to find that through your experience, it would be very interesting to hear.
I think there's a way in which you don't find your life's purpose finds you. And so if you're rushing and looking and like stressing yourself out, it might like you might be too busy looking to notice it. I've experienced that when I've received messages from spirit or ancestors or the universe or whatever you want to believe in or call it, those messages are sometimes so quiet and subtle. And if I'm looking for it, or if I'm on social media, or if I'm watching TV while listening to music and working on my computer and talking on the phone with my friend, I don't hear it. And so I think part of the advice is to not rush and not get stressed out if you haven't found it or if it hasn't found you. And again, like, I feel bad for a lot of young people because I think these days we live in a culture where there's so many distractions. But to try to find moments of quiet where you can listen to, like, it might be a bird that gives you a clue as to what your purpose and vocation is. It might be the wind or a breath of it, like you never know where inspiration is going to come from, but if you're not quiet enough, you might miss it.
Oh,
And so
true.
don't rush and keep asking the right questions and try to get rid of the distractions that keep us from our purpose.
So true. So there are so much more questions that I want to ask, but maybe this is the last one. What it, you're practicing nonviolence in your life, and do you have goals, or do you have some like things that you want to do in the future through this work of nonviolence, or dream, or?
I mean, yes and no. Yes, in that I don't know if you know this. I'm having a child in May, in 2 months,
Wow.
and knowing how much I was hurt in my own childhood, I think there's no greater task as a practitioner of nonviolence than to try to take everything I've learned into my relationship with my child. So that's the yes. But also when you ask me about goals, yeah, my goal is for the fundamental transformation of everything we think we know about being human and the healing of all traumas and the reconciliation of all relationships. And, in nonviolence, we always say that, like, beloved community, which is a world where all conflict has been reconciled, where all people have achieved their full human potential, where everyone has what they need, is always our long-term goal. But it's a North Star, right? And there's a story in the United States when slaves were trying to escape from the plantations. They were trying to escape to the north because the southern United States slavery was legal, the northern United States slavery was not. So a lot of slaves would escape and try to go north. And to get there, they would always look for the North Star at night and walk towards the North Star. And they knew that no matter how far they walked, they were never going to get to the North Star, right? But they knew that as long as they kept walking towards the North Star, then they would get to where they needed to go. And I think it's similar with the goal of nonviolence, to create a peaceful, nonviolent world. Who knows if we'll ever get there? We may never get to a world where every person lives with everything they need and there's never any violence, but it's still our goal. It's still the North Star that we're walking towards. And as long as we keep moving in that direction, then maybe we'll still get to where we need to go, you know?
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And that you're not doing that alone. Like people who understand the importance of this positive peace and nonviolence are looking at the same North
Right.
Star. And then eventually we will be together collectively go to that place. And
Yeah,
we come closer and closer every day as
I
we
think
work.
so.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kazu-san, for sharing your beautiful story and wisdom.
So before real closing, let me make a few announcements. First, about our upcoming youth event. We plan to continue holding events like this several times a year to foster a community of young people like you from around the world who will play a leading role as peacemakers in their communities and respective countries. The next youth event is planned on Saturday, July 13th this year, Japan time. Mr. Joaquin Leguia, founder of ANIA from Peru, who promotes children's land programs around the world, will be our next guest speaker. We will give you further details by coming June. Next, about the 2024 International Essay Contest for young people. We are inviting young people up to 25 of age to write and submit their essays in this year's edition of the essay contest. The theme of this year is My Experience of Overcoming Conflict. And the deadline for entry is 15th of June. You can find the link on the website, but you can also see the same links on the chat box. Next, about participant survey on today's youth event. Soon after the program, we will send you an email with an online questionnaire about today's event. We'll really appreciate your feedback. And you can also see the same the links to the online survey on your chat box. So in this survey, we will ask once again whether you'd like to sign up as a member of the Goi Peace Youth Community. It is a global youth community where members from various backgrounds can connect, share their voices, and learn from each other to create a peaceful world together. If you are signed up already, you will receive future announcements of our events and other programs, and have an access to the Zoom rooms in the future events like this. So we hope you stay connected with us and invite your friends to join the youth community. As soon as the link to the video archive of today's event is ready, as Maki said, we will let you know. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So once again, thank you so much, Kazu, for joining for the last 1 hour and 40 minutes with us and sharing so much of your experience and inspirational talks and wisdoms you shared with us. Thank you, the dear participants, joining us from all over the world on both Zoom and on YouTube live stream. We hope to see you all again soon. And let me say goodbye and have a nice weekend.